Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, trans and queers, as well as any alternate timeline versions of ourselves, and also every kind of artificial and natural non-human intelligences that may tune into this broadcast, welcome. This is the Integral Stage, and I'm Layman Pascal, and here to be the yang-ish yin to my yin-ish yang is Sally Adnams Jones. And you know, folks, the reason I just used all of those gender dualities in the introduction is by way of segueing into a very interesting topic. Recently, I wrote a Substack article called Is Eros Safe? Eros, of course, is the old philosophical, theological, and psychoanalytic term that's been taken over by communities of evolutionary spirituality to mean the way that polarized forces reflect and lure each other into leading-edge growth, convergence, and emergence at interactive thresholds of intrigue and arousal. I think this is a very important and useful way of thinking. But as I said in the article, we also have to hold it responsibly by taking seriously the many ways in which this kind of thinking and languaging can go astray, the ways it can invoke forces we're not prepared to be good containers for, and even lead well-meaning people down murky pathways into over-sexualizing their wisdom practice or degrading their own eroticism, creativity, and capacity for healthy dualities. So Sally reached out with the offer to unfold this yin-yang, eros, and emergence conversation one more step along its path. And in my official capacity as a person with a beard and testicles and a platform, I hereby declare that's what we're going to do. Hi, Sally.
Hi, Layman. I couldn't imagine a more apt pairing up, temporally as it is, erotically, intellectually, emotionally, to unpack this. You are such a beautiful example of an integrated human. And I feel so met by you. So thank you for agreeing to unfold this with me. I feel myself, this identityless identity of being both a gender and so much more than that. I am a possibility for creation. And so that's been my life journey, how to unpack that. And I've come to the conclusion that we live in duality. It's a binary. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with it at every level of the body, sexually, creatively, meditatively? And to me, it's an integration of opposites. I myself have a very yin essence. I show up in an estrogenic body. And yet I've had to cultivate an extreme yang as well as the yin through life experiences, through just doing a Ph.D. You have to heal that object-subject split just to even do that. Had to become bright orange. That's the masculine emergence and spiral. So I've developed the warm and the cool colors in myself. And this is an ancient teaching from Taoism, from Tantra in India. So I'm so excited to unfold this with you. It is Eros, the principles of emergence that we're talking about.
I'm really intrigued by the different ways that those dualities can relate to each other, right? They can be considered as separate complementary things. They can be alternated or oscillated back and forth between. We can think of them as somehow simultaneously transparent in a non-duality. We can also look to operate or inhabit the edge, the threshold between the two of them. So that's four. I mean, there must be dozens of other ways to treat these dualities responsibly. I wonder which ones you're most drawn towards.
Yeah, I love this. It's so contemporary, this conversation. Just the language you just used, Layman, oscillations and dipolarities, that's in our language. It's emerging more and more. So I'd love to unfold that a little bit. It's about the distance of the binary. And that is fluid. So we can be completely conflictual and We can unpack how if you get stuck in one or the other, that becomes pathological or toxic. Health is considered fluidity. So we can navigate that distance between the binary. And if we just imagine the visual gestalt of the Tao right now, it's two parts. So we're talking about holonic here, Kussler's holonic nature of reality. Two parts making a whole, but it's got a boundary, clear boundary. And it's inter-included in the two spots. So I just want to unpack that visual metaphor. It's so helpful. That's why I use it for the term integral Taoism, as opposed to Tantra. That's a different thing. Tantra's stuck at the sexual level. What I'm trying to unpack is the full body level of creativity as well as sexuality. So that binary can come very close together and be boundaried and operate as a whole. It can split apart, be conflictual, or it can synthesize and merge. So what we're looking at is this movement between parts is Eros. That's what Eros to me is navigating merge and emerge. Just even that word is topical in what we're naming stuff right now. This is the principle of emergence. And I prefer the E-merge as opposed to one word, emerge, because that's the masculine. The feminine is inter-included if you go E-merge. And it works as a pair.
You know, I'm thinking now about, here's something I don't know, is how general my own experience is, right? Because I can look at myself as, right, I've got an androgenic body, and I've done practices to make myself more comfortable with feminine elements over the course of my life. And there's kind of a wisdom in that. But also, there are classically shamans, outsiders, some elements of the tribe that difference doesn't make as much difference to. And I also feel like I'm in that category. It always seemed preposterous, a lot of the differences, or at least the holding of the differences. And I had this natural instinct to cross back and forth over that boundary every chance I got. So some of what I've come to understand might be a wisdom for people in general, and some of it might just be a wisdom for people like me, whatever that's pointing to.
Yeah, I think this is super important, the fluidity. So we can oscillate. We can also, in the right context, merge, like in the sexual act. And then we fall apart into separate parts again. And when the two come together and become one, a third is created. That's what I'm interested in, is that creation of the third. So it's healthy to be able to separate and do your own agentic, independent masculinity thing, but also to be able to relate and do community. So the pairing doesn't mean you lose your separate gift. If you're fluidly navigating distance, you can do a variety of things and choose to merge, and you'll get an ecstatic state like orgasm, meditation, merging left and right brain. You get biofeedback. Evolution wants us to do this, so it rewards us with ecstasy. We can merge at the hips and we can procreate. We can merge the heart and the mind, and we can feel this ecstasy of co-creation too between different people. So at the different levels of the body, we're staying separate as well as, so the parts and wholes philosophy of Kussler is extremely important to understand. Wilbur called this transclude, or include and transcend. It's the line and the circle working together as the phallus and the yoni. It's imagined in Hebraic thinking as line and circle qualities. Shows up in India as Shiva, Shakti, consciousness and energy. In China as the Tao. It's come through every single culture. And what I love is it's secretly visible and available on Spiral Dynamics Spiral with the cool and the warm colors that really nobody wants to talk about yet. And that's what we're doing, is that the more we develop, the closer these parts come together. I think this is my understanding. It's why I'm writing Integral Taoism. So we start off really separate. As I said, the distance is important. At Blue, we have our roles, our gendered specialization, and parts come together, we create a family. But those parts keep separating and coming together through the spiral, warm and cool, merge or emerge. You'll notice the capacities for each stage is a different level. I think until we've actually done the internal merger, I would say at around turquoise, the yin and the yang have literally come together in McGill-Christ's understanding of left and right brain, object and subject. So finally, that distance at Blue has sort of oscillated until it's an internal ecstasy merger. That is our way of being and doing come together. We no longer need the external part to actually reach that orgasm. I'll be frank and say there's states of ecstasy available there. And we're rewarded all the way along. It feels good at the different levels of the body, which show up as different stages.
Are you ever skeptical about that reward? Like, how do we know it's leading us in the right direction?
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question, Layman, and I know you know this. It's about flow states. So let me go into that a little bit. That reward keeps taking us into this oneness, the true self. We can find oneness. And that's the only way we become open to understanding our other identity. But then we have to come into two-ness again and separate and function in duality and go do our service to humanity and alleviate suffering and do the thing off the mat. But we always take that flavor with us. Once we've actually experienced the oneness of an altered state, we can no longer really be a nihilist or a depressive. We understand that we're both non-dual and dual. And we get there through the flow state. That's when we kind of begin to understand that inbuilt into the whole manifestation system is the biofeedback reward. So we keep dipping into that until it becomes real and it becomes a stage from which all the doing comes from the being. So we've understood states in Taoism and Tantra for 3,000 years. This has recently been updated with science. So someone like Mahali Csikszentmihalyi was an academic who spoke about flow states. He felt that this is a state, and how does that arise? It's when the skill capacity that we've developed meets the exact challenge of the moment. And we can surrender to that flow. We give up control, the ego steps out of the way. When the capacity or the skill is higher than the challenge, we're bored. When the skill capacity is lower than the challenge, we're stressed. So it's a perfect marriage of the masculine discipline and the feminine surrender to the moment. So this sounds technical, but it's a real state. When we've put in the 10,000 hours, like Malcolm Gladwell talks about, we did the repetition, we did the practices, we did the hardcore masculine. Then we can literally just surrender and give it over and experience the feminine through trust and surrender. That's when emergence happens through the body. That's when the two parts of ourselves can co-create an entity that we didn't even know was there. That's when we experience being taken over by some force of nature. Actually, it feels to me like source is coming through us at that point. We're co-creating with emergence then.
My feeling is that transcendental dualism goes a step beyond non-duality. If we conceive non-duality as a kind of homogeneous unity, that the possibility for stereoscopic death and the flow opportunities that are afforded by the play or the description of these two forces. I think that's essential. I think insofar as there is developmental layering, that at each layer, there's some synthesis of what seemed like yin and yang at the previous layer. So it feels like there's a convergence, and that at a certain point, there's so much nuanced precision around that dual and not dual are constantly the case. And that's either an end or the beginning of a new set of developmental stages. So I love all of that. But I'm also a little bit concerned about some elements of this phrasing. Like you're using the word orgasm, which is great, but also Netflix is full of documentaries about sex cults that have gone astray. Like how do we negotiate the provocation of the eroticized terminology?
This is so pertinent, really. Navigating, I'd say, the bastardization of classical Tantra, which, I'll just be frank, American Neo-Tantra it's important, but it's such a small part of classical Tantra. So yeah, when we get stuck in where just the pelvis or the genitals might merge, we cannot see the big picture, that this is just a taste of what is available practically to us at every level. So we've had polarity teachings for 3,000 years. China, the Tao, India, Tantra, Hebraic teaching of line and circle, Kabbalah. We've also got contemporary teachers of polarity teachings that can get stuck in just parts of the story. So, for example, we have men are from Mars, women are from Venus. That was a beautiful story. It's true, but partial. It's about qualities, which are important to understand how men and women are different. We have polarity teachers like David Data, who spoke about a new, deeper understanding of that as an essence within us, the feminine and the masculine. He took us further, which was wonderful. We have polarity teachings like Mark Gaffney, who talks about Eros, and he does talk about the sexual modeling the bigger picture, but he actually teaches mostly about sexuality as Eros. Although he always points to it being a fractal of the whole, and he doesn't expand on that. So he doesn't go into the creativity of that or at the higher levels of the union. We have this wonderful new understanding of the brain with Ian McGilchrist. That's a kind of a polarity teaching. It's about focus, the narrow masculine focus as opposed to the wider, softer, feminine focus, the left and the right brain, and how we need to do both. So I think this understanding, even on the quantum level, we're talking about particles and waves. We're talking about manifestation popping in and out of nothing to something all the time. There's a binary. Duality is a binary. It's a dipolar dance, and Eros is the electricity between the two. So what I did was look at the history of polarity teachings, look at what's short. They're all true, but very partial. Some about genital orgasm, some about qualities of being, some are about hemispheric inter-inclusion. What I did was take Wilber's 4 quadrants and apply it to all those teachings to try and get all the perspectives, which includes the upper right. It includes the new movement towards surgery and hormones and changing our gender, to the lower right, the political movements, the Me Too movement, the masculinism that's arising, healthy teachings for men as well as women, and all the quadrants. To me, I think that that's the biggest picture we have so far on duality, because when the one splits into two and the two come together and diversity is created, that's a principle of emergence, not just sexuality.
I entertain myself with this phrase, the age of tantric patriarchs, which is roughly the 20th century. A lot of people, a lot of guys in that period of time that meant a lot to me when I was studying spirituality, Osho and Trungpa and all these characters. And thinking that way, I noticed that all the people on your list up to you were men. Are there women on that list, or is this a new moment when somebody like you starts to be the female version of taking duality thinking to the next step?
Yeah, so, I'm a product of my history and my feminine lineage and all the trauma of shutting down the voice. So the yin, traditionally at blue, is just recede, receive. Stay quiet, make space for the yang. So I think I'm encouraging women to come out of that into orange, find your voice, do the objective shift psychologically, begin to look at the thing, learn how to articulate it. Takes a lot of work, and get into your yang. Yang up, girls, because we need you, just as we need boys to yin down a little bit, so that we can now start to see a future that is this beautiful. This is where every evolution is taking us. We're now co-creating the new narrative. So I think I'm just maybe because I was fascinated as a kid about creativity and the principles of that. I was involved in the creative arts for so long. I started seeing this pattern. I have a strong apophenic pattern recognition facility in me. So first of all, I noticed that the men in creative circles were extremely in touch with their yin. Masculine bodies that could do the flowing essence were unbelievably creative. The best geniuses to me are yang body, yin essence. And I began to see that. And yin bodies with a yang essence, pretty close, but actually I don't think they're quite matched because you need that execution of that yang. Anyway, but I was seeing that women who created were rejected for being too yang, and men who created were rejected for being too yin. How could we be wrong? What we were seeing was this principle at work through their bodies. Later on, I became interested that this is actually not just about creativity. It's not just about sexuality. It's about evolution as a principle, fractal principle. When binaries come together in a body, things start to happen. So that was from a young kid. I started noticing patterns, and now, then I came in contact with Ken's teachings and the 4 quadrants and his teachings on merger and emergence and agency and communion, and it just all fell together. And then I saw spiral dynamics, and it was evident to me it's right there in the spiral. And I was a lover of Tantra. I had a wholesale Indian guru for 20 years who taught me Tantric, classical Tantra. So it's just falling together as a new emergence. And as a woman, I guess I just got there before somebody else did. And I really love the fact that women are finally finding their voices.
Yeah, the voice element seems crucial to me. In my mind, one of the most feminist films I ever saw was called In a World. And it's about the death of the leading movie narrator. The guy would go, in a world, where that guy, and he's a real guy. And so in the movie, we see his death, and then people are competing. The number 2 movie narrators are competing, and one of them has a daughter who also wants to play in that space. And the film is her personal journey to becoming a voiceover narrator. But it was a really powerful film to take the voice that frames a world rather than just be the voice that expresses how you feel within a world. And it seemed to me when I saw it just tremendously significant to be able to open up that range of the voice's expression.
Yeah, and I'm noticing you're inviting me to speak. So you are in this pairing being recessive and allowing my expression, which you fluidly play with yin and yang right here. Like you've just given it over to me, the space. That's not traditional. It's usually that the masculine does the voicing and the creating. So you've really just got into your yin and offered me the space, that you've created a container here and you're holding that with your consciousness. So let's look at that as a visual. Layman is holding the container for Sally to do the flow, the expression. That's really yin and yang. Right now we're partnering to create a third entity. So the container is often masculine. Even if you're just doing this yourself, the strong container holds the flow. And that's actually a cross-section of the throat. So let's look at that's like a hose pipe. This is Eros. Now I'm going to describe it. For a lot of women, there's just a big kink here. We've been taught to keep quiet. Once you open that, like if you imagine a hose pipe and you open the tap a little bit, often there can be an erratic, like a fire hose. It just comes out. The women are really angry right now. They're verbalizing a lot. It's part of healing the trauma. That's going to settle down. It's just that the throat just got opened, and we can hear that across all platforms right now. The throat opened. So that'll settle down as the kink gets unkinked and the flow begins to come. That flow will become more conscious. The masculine container for the flow will come into partnership, and you'll be able to regulate. It's like, how much do I let this tap now actually allow the flow? So that's the masculine, the holding of the flow. It's like two banks. The feminine can become toxic when it just flows out of that container and it floods. And if the banks are too rigid or blocked, then the flow can't happen. So this is actually, you and I are creating this in partnership as we manifest what it means when there's a masculine and a feminine. There's containership and flow. Might I just add, this goes now into the social from the individual. When you get mastery of the tap, it's no longer about your flow just flowing anywhere. It's about noticing the field. If you imagine that as water, and applying the water judiciously to water the seeds, not drown them, not cause drought. So flooding is not great. Neither is drought. It's getting the right amount of flow onto the field, the seeds. That takes the extra step of being socially aware with your flow.
There's so many foldings of the masculine and the feminine in all of this. So if I'm holding space here, I'm curious about and making space for you, and I'm remembering and holding my body, and I'm thinking about the recording and who sees it and all these. So I'm holding all these things, but I come into that holding with a will and a strategy and a discipline. And it also makes me think of times when I'm trying to hold space for someone. It starts to feel too much for me, and then I have the option to start to be more assertively expressive, or move into a position where, as the masculine, I'm no longer exactly holding the space. I'm holding the center spot around which the feminine is doing permutations. And so sometimes the space holding forces that shift in me. If I'm in an intimate discussion, I want the feminine to be able to do all the things it does, because I've seen that move into its next phase, but it's too much for me to contain. And I can very subtly shift out of being the container to being like the maypole around which the dance is occurring. And sometimes that's, like a health thing. It's like something I have to do to protect myself, but also it opens up a new dimension of yin-yang interaction within that process, which sometimes is extremely ecstatic.
Yeah, so this energy is often beyond our control. When the yin and the yang create this polarity, there's an energy, and it's often the surrender to that brings emergence. So it's really hard for the masculine to sometimes surrender and say, I can't control this. But then often it will move into observer role, the objective. So it will be looking at the feminine. So that's often a beautiful dynamic, is the masculine is the observer. The feminine embodies the subjective. So there's the objective, subjective dance going on here. The masculine can enter the subjective at that point and let go of control of being the observer. Hopefully the feminine can at will come out of that subjective and become the observer and hold the space too. So as we go up the spiral, we've developed those capacities to be fluid in ourselves. So it's this distance thing too. We can oscillate or we can synthesize, but healthy movement means we can always come out of that again. We're not stuck in either pathological distance or pathological merger. That takes practice. I know it's not appropriate to merge at the pelvis with you right now. I know it's totally appropriate to merge at the heart and the mind, and that is equally erotic and co-creative. So some gurus, when they get that part mixed up, it can become very difficult because two types of people are now interacting. The narcissistic type of person that's stuck in individuation and separation, and the codependent who's stuck in merger and loss of agency, can come together and create that whole. So then it functions as one whole, but as separate parts, it's not healthy because they haven't got the boundary. There's always a boundary.
This is something that's on my mind a little bit, is the fact that the phrasing that culture has evolved around the pelvic version of this is connected to so many ancient evolutionary and unconscious drives that have a tendency to spill over and take action even when we're unaware of it, even when we think we're sort of cleanly moving to the level that's appropriate. We aren't always doing that, right? I can certainly imagine myself sitting at the front of a room full of people and using sexualized terminology with them, thinking I'm being extremely well balanced about it. But in hindsight, you see all of these other moves that you're making, okay, because all of the history of life on Earth has designed you to make those moves. So you may not be aware of how much is invoked by the use of the erotic terminology.
Yeah, so at that point, what is metaphorical language can also be embodied. So I'm involved in tantric groups of various application of the merger. I feel that's perfectly healthy until you also bring teacher-student relationship into it, because then there's a power dynamic. And I've had extensive experience with groups like that I've now chosen to separate from, because these two polarities of circle and line can become a bit pathological. So when there's power over people, you can ostensibly say these are consenting adults and get away with that as a teacher with your students. What I see is when that starts to enmesh, that dynamic, I don't actually see consenting adults. So this is problematic when there's a codependent and a narcissist, which some teachers can be with shadow. there's no healthy boundary. Until you've got that yin-yang sign mastered, which is 2 parts with a boundary, and able to navigate that, consent doesn't even come into it. So you can make somebody sign a non-disclosure agreement and get away with saying these are all consenting adults, but actually mostly they don't have their agency yet. So this is developmental. So I know this is complicated, but as we said, there's stages of polarity teachings. When we get stuck in just the merger at the pelvis, as opposed to the merger of the heart and the mind and the brain, it can become quite problematic, even if you say that you're a consenting adult. I don't think until you're fully agentic with a boundary, you can choose to lift the boundary. Otherwise, you're just submitting without agency. So this is where the masculinity is healthy in women, as well as the surrender in men. But doing this appropriately takes extra ethics.
So one thing people do to try to secure their agency is to move into a defensive recoil position, to hunker down, to densify, to pull away from the other and the stimulus. Is that a natural prelude to moving into a healthier agency, or is it a misguided strategy that leads in the wrong direction?
No, I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Layman, because when we're born, we are in this natural merged state with the universe. It's pre-personal oceanic oneness. As we develop, we move into separation and agency and individuation. This is by design. So we kind of peak at midlife with the maximum amount of agency we'll ever have, at which point we can then choose to go back into the oceanic oneness. Before we've reached agency, we don't have choice yet. So the choice is part of this, and that's why I don't even agree when we say consenting adults until I see somebody's development. Masculine agentic separation is healthy for all of us. And only at that point can we assert a new level of surrender, which to me is post-rational, transpersonal oneness. And physically, anyway, we will come back into oneness as our parts separate and we die. So there's a life trajectory from merged to emerged, back to merged. There's also, this can happen in a weekend. We move between these parts, healthy separation, especially if you're an introvert, healthy merger if you're an extrovert. These things can happen in one instant. In fact, they can be happening at the same time. I feel conflicted. I want to be with you and I don't want to be with you. And that can be problematic for intimacy in a relationship. So yeah, how we navigate the distance is particularly important if we're talking about tantric teachings from usually a man in power to usually a bunch of women who are fairly codependent unless they're already agentic and they're choosing it. Fine, healthy.
What does a healthy consent boundary look like in a conversation like this that's primarily mental and verbal? How do we secure that between us?
Do you feel like we breached a boundary?
I don't.
No, I don't either. Yeah, so this is kind of, it's a somatic proprioception of you definitely did not violate any of my space, even intellectually. So you are a beautiful example of someone who knows how to navigate this distance. That to me is a maturity thing. So it would also be beholden on me to suggest this has happened, please respect my boundary. It's about respect. And just being aware of the development of the other, as well as your own development. So once we've reached a certain stage of development within ourselves, we can't help but be aware of the social connection as well. So the tantric thing is internal, but it's also social at any given moment. And that yin-yang sign has the healthy boundary. So there's always two-ness that we need to respect and also know how to appropriately access oneness. It's contextual. Takes EQ.
Very easy to think that you respect the other. And we actually talked about this before a little bit around the role that curiosity toward the vulnerability and toward the sensitivity that feels betrayed. Like a lot of people in situations of power asymmetries, which is an understandable situation to be in, simply aren't curious when anyone else suggests that they feel disrupted or betrayed or disrespected. And to me, it seems very natural that we would be intrigued by that particular yin elements, like rather than just isolating myself in the idea that I am a respecter. Why would I not be intrigued by the sensitive root of your sense of being disrespected? So that's a thing, that's sort of a puzzle that I'm looking at in people, is why isn't curiosity and a kind of erotic relationship in that sense more prevalent?
Well, how I see you, Layman, is a very creative human being. And I know you're an artist as well, which means that to you, it's perfectly natural to have access to your right brain. So why would I say that? It's because I'm looking into this more and more. I think empathy, which is what you're talking about, requires a level of imagination. So in other words, for me to understand what it's like to be in Layman's shoes, I need to have some imagination and curiosity. That in itself will build my empathy for you. So if we're stuck in our McGilchrist language left brain, which is focused on problem solving and the objective and the external, and we can't access the imagination, which is in the right brain, the intuitive, we do lack empathy. This is really problematic about being stuck in the objective. To me, and I'll go so far as to say, hyper-objectivity is another way of saying evil. What I mean by evil, it's a lack of awareness of sentience in another. So that's when it gets really out of whack on the spectrum between hyper-objectivity and hyper-subjectivity, both of which are toxic, usually masculine, usually feminine. Being able to come to center, objective and subjective, is health. It's not right or wrong. Let's call it health and balance and harmony. So, and that's internal as well. I need to be able to have enough objectivity to come here and talk to you and have access to years of study. I also need to have imagination to make this a present moment flow, and also have the empathy to respect you and ask you how you are and include you. So there's EQ and IQ going on here. That's the kind of, if you want to be reductive, the two things that we need. Masculine has really made IQ the end all and be all. Feminine is specialized in EQ. So when we're looking at yin-yang balance, it's about realizing that health is about developing both of those things.
One of the common complaints about yin-yang thinking is that it underserves non-binary and plural modes of existence. Now, the automatic response in the back of my mind is to think, oh, that's describing a version of yin-yang as the yang and the non-binary plurality as the yin in that circumstance. But I'm curious how you look at the challenge that the plural and the non-binary poses to transcendental dualist thinking.
Yeah, this is an added complexity, and I think that's why I had to bring the 4 quadrants to this dynamic, because depending what quadrant you look at for the non-binary, what does that mean? So if you're going to do the upper right, the bodies, we can now move well beyond binaries into non-binaries. We can, we're on a spectrum, gender spectrum for a start, physically, hormonally, but we can also change things up with surgery and clothing and ways of being. And so we're more fluidly able now, even in the upper right, to play with a movement beyond binary. But it's usually 2 things come together to create the third, which is the non-binary. Yeah, so this is an interesting, we can talk about it in the other quadrants, but it's showing up mainly now as problematic to conservative folks when we talk about the upper right, actually physically changing these things. You know, in spiritual practice, the level of attainment is I no longer have an identity that is fixed in duality. So if we go deep enough with that, that moves beyond gender identity. Gender identity is a surface identity in the spiritual practice. They never noticed that before. But now that we've got green coming online, we're actually calling these things a gendered binary or a non-binary. So deeper spiritual practice means we have to go beyond that identity anyway. And if we're playing at that level, we know that that's just a surface manifestation. Not only are we stuck in roles, which is the lower left, how culture wants us to stay fixed in a binary role. Then we go to the upper right, we can change it with surgery. Like, wow, this is a whole new dimension. We have no idea where this is going, and I would never claim to understand yet. But I want to include it in the 4 quadrant language of Yin-Yang.
In a developmental stack, pathology is kind of relative, right? Pathology describes a pattern that might be appropriate to a lower level, but relative to the level you're working on, it's not appropriate. So there are ethnocentric theocratic societies throughout history, but when Germany went in the 20th century from being a modern society back to an ethnocentric theocratic society, that struck everyone as a social pathology, and perhaps rightly so. But where in the, like, say, stack of languaging do you see it becoming problematic in terms of people's discussion of these things? Like, what do you think is a regressive or misleading or even pathological way to talk about the erotic emergent dimensions of yin-yang? Like, where would the threshold be? Below that, that's problematic. Above that, we've got this whole range of concepts and words to play with. Where do you sense a cutoff, if you do?
Yeah, so we're talking about movement again between opposites, like movement between conservatives tend to want to keep the status quo, and liberals tend to want to shift it forward. So that becomes problematic if liberals trying to ask too much, the conservatives will dig their heels in. But this happens on the interior too, psychologically, with every human. How fast do we move forward, and how much do we conserve? And I think in a way, this is the masculine and the feminine. So there needs to be structure that keeps stability. Too much change is like flow just spilling over its banks. It has no structure. So getting the momentum of movement correct is integration. We want to contain change with some levels of keeping things the same, conserving structures, and we want to integrate newness. As Whitehead said, this relentless movement into novelty is built into the system. And how do we bring people along psychologically? So this is, to me, the meta-modern movement. It is psychological. It's learning how to keep some things that are really functional and learning how to throw out what's not functional. So keeping some of the structures, the best of the pre-modern and the modern, bring those forward, keep the structure, honor and respect tradition, and yet keep the flow. The cutting edge of evolution is kind of moving into the void. It's moving into the feminine, the unknown, the uncertainty, the mystery. So that masculine and feminine is playing at the cutting edge of evolution and emergence. It's keeping stability as well as allowing for change and flow. To do that psychologically through the arts and through all the products we're creating, that takes the 10,000 hours, the masculine, the discipline, to know the stuff, to keep the stability and the structure while still moving into emergence and novelty. That's on the interior, to bring that forward, as well as with cultural properties. It's a massive job. It's not easy, but we're up for it. We're evolving. We can do this. We can play at the cutting edge.
Well, if we assume that this conversation is part of the cutting edge of the understanding of these dualities, and this conversation is moving into the void, into the feminine mystery that's one step ahead of us in terms of yin-yang thinking, seems like questions haunt and guard and open that edge. What are the outstanding questions for you? What do you still want to know or still feel is potentially knowable about all this stuff that isn't yet known and clarified?
Yeah, that's a massive question. I still don't think we've dealt with the question of suffering. We always just want to move into cognitive answers. So we're never holding the ambiguity of the body and the mind. The body suffers a lot. We still haven't solved world hunger. We still are only just beginning to talk about trauma and the way that interrupts the flow of emergence. So we've got massive practical problems. And yet we're always tempted to just move into creating new narrative. And I do that too. Like, I'm not pointing fingers. That's, as an artist and a creative, that's where I love to play with ideas. And I'm a pattern seeker and an artist. And I just want to disappear and quietly make stuff. But as I get older, I'm noticing that's all very well for you, Sally, but now the field is needing something. And to hear what is needed next. I can't say what that is because that's a mystery and it will emerge. And in the problems of needs, we still have to meet those. I just think that holding the polarity within is super important for emergence. And I know I'm a very annoying voice that keeps saying that to people who just want to fly off into the world of narrative. So we just need to check, where is the narrative coming from? Is it coming from a place of fear, fight and flight? Or is it coming from a place of stability and this ecstatic merger of internal yin and yang? Because those are the narratives that last. We can look at the best of the pre-modern and modern texts. They come from a place of integration and balance. So instead of just jumping to problem solving from the left brain and fight and flight, if we can hold that ambiguity, trust that the universe knows what it's doing, it always has, and it will emerge through us. So creating the optimal context in the body for novelty to emerge is, I think, a level of mastery, because we know that when the two parts come together, the best thing is created. So that's inside our body, it's in our community, it's how we build a narrative of the future that actually holds line and circle thinking, not just repeating line after line after line, which is modernism. Our addiction to the linear is modernism. That can become hyper-modern. So the meta is kind of building line and circle into the future so that it's optimal for all of us, and not just repeating the past. So we have an understanding of this dynamic now, and that it is a principle of emergence. So can we do that through our bodies is the level I'm trying to work at, which means I get into an optimal state before I try to create something. Because fight and flight is default. And I might add that there's language in our evolutionary spirituality that talks about urgency, that is the impulse of evolution in our body. We need to be careful that the urgency is not fight and flight. Because that is beautiful, it keeps us safe, and it problem solves and maintains what is already here. That's how we've survived so well as a species, because the masculine does that beautifully. Jumps in, it saves things, it fixes things, but it maintains the status quo. For true emergence, we also need the imaginal and the intuitive. So the masculine fight and flight is always our default. It's primary, it's beautiful, it's how we got here. We need a level of safety to even access the imaginal and the right brain. So the masculine keeps the container of safety for new emergence to happen. But the new emergence is about allowing the imaginal to come through so novelty can actually arrive. There's two things going on here. While we're still doing narratives that preserve and protect, which we need, safety first. The masculine's at the front, doing his protective job. We've seen cultures as well, like cultures at war don't create new stuff. So cultures at peace that the masculine has accomplished for us can then move into Renaissance. We generally can only do that when there's enough safety, and the masculine does that for us. But that's not the same job as creation.
It does seem to be a need for a new clarification of a masculine protector role in the culture that we're creating. What stood out to me, though, when you were saying that was this sense that I have a lot of confidence in a particular thing. And that thing that I have a lot of confidence in is the ability of people who have an inner practice of making their somatic experience into a robust container, who also have the meta-modern intellectual fluidity to be on both sides of every interpretive possibility. When people have both of those skills, then their intimate conversations can become a healing ground for larger things, that you can heal something. It feels like you can heal something of the pain that men and women have gone through together anciently within your own intimate discussions. You imaginally allow that, but in order for that to be done well, you have to be somatically and affectively very grounded, and you have to be able to both identify with the pain that's being expressed and not identify with it, so that you don't get trapped, but you still have the ability to bring it into the processing of that conversation. I've seen that work in my own experience, and I see a crop of people coming who have both of those capacities. I hope that they use them in this way.
Yeah, Layman. So I don't want to overcomplicate things, because even as we're speaking, there comes into my awareness, Sally, speak the language of boys so boys can hear you, because I really, really want to reach boys. So I'm already couching my language, not for you, for whoever might be listening. But I'm going to break out of that mold and speak from my wider awareness as a feminine being, which is that integration happens bio, psycho, social, eco, spiritual. That's a lot of work. So when we're fully integrated, and I know this is too much for the left brain to imagine, that integration and awareness is happening biologically, psychologically, socially, ecologically, spiritually. So it's like concentric, increasing, expanding circles of awareness. Ken spoke about that. So what is cosmocentric consciousness? It means that you're aware on all those levels. You can't bypass any of them. That's a lifetime of work. So we tend to bypass a lot of those. So if we want to just flower intellectually, we might have bypassed the bio-psycho-social integration. So for example, somebody sent my Yin-Yang writings to a white male professor to have a look at. And he immediately said, this is too feminist and ecological. So I'm already dealing with someone not able to manage that complexity, who's critiquing me and reducing my complexity to what he can understand. And I'm aware that the right brain is wider than the left brain. And we are constantly trying to reduce our understandings and language just to reach people. I had to learn how to speak masculine, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm speaking from objective analysis from the outside because I want to reach men, and they can't hear me when I speak feminine. When I'm with my yin friends, I speak feminine. We're talking about ecology and proprioception and somatics. And so the new metamodern is to see the big picture, which is yin and yang. It's moving from the biology, the quanta, through the biology, the psychology, into the intellectual, into the social, into the ecological and the spiritual. Can we do that in one lifetime? Integrate on all those levels, the yin and the yang. It's a lot of work.
Who do you see doing this really well? Who gives you hope?
So in our community, and I don't want to put people on the spot, I am seeing so many beautiful people doing this. There are so many men out in our adjacent communities who are talking about ecology, who are talking about feelings. How do we raise our sons to be aware? It's already happening. It's so heartwarming for me. I have 2 grown sons who are doing this work with their wives too, that completely balanced households, just sharing everything. It's this fluid. They, try to all earn money. They try to all run the domestic situation. They raise the kids, hug them, read them. There's no gender distinction. This is taking families to a whole new level of play and unity. And I see that with our members in the adjacent communities. It's stunning. I don't want to put people on the spot, but I'm seeing it more and more. What I'm not seeing, I see that in the men. What I'm not seeing is women stepping forward to include their analysis, their objectivity. How do we speak about this instead of from this so that people can hear us? I would love to call women forward to start doing this. And I know it's because the feminine requires a container of safety, and that's the masculine's job. So this is problematic for our epistemologies and ontologies, that the male container needs to be protective and allow for the feminine to come forward. She doesn't have the testosterone to fight you just to be heard. She won't speak. It's too exhausting for a body without testosterone to keep fighting just for space. So that has to be co-created in partnership. The thing is, we can't imagine that just because bodies with testosterone can see more truth or speak and articulate it better as a perspective. That's just not true, but that's how it's turning up because it requires some aggression for narrative dominance. So allowing the feminine equally valid perspective requires you to make space for that. Because testosterone actually protects the male body a bit for aggression and competition. That's what it's beautifully designed for. Bodies without testosterone don't have that energetic resource to compete. But that's been confused with inadequacy and has been invalidated, their perspective. I've heard lots of conversations. So women just annoy me when they speak, and their perspective obviously then doesn't have validity. So let's just keep talking amongst ourselves. Well, it's just a problem of testosterone. It doesn't make the perspective truer. Both perspectives are true, but partial.
I think the energetic burnout issue is huge, right? On the one hand, this tendency of people who, you're describing them as not having as much testosterone, so it's exhausting for them to try to fight to be heard. And on the other hand, there's this masculine thing where it's exhausting to continually be waiting to hear the thing. You're hearing a bunch of things, but you're not hearing anything that's actionable. And so you're just holding yourself in readiness until you're burned out. So on both sides, there's an energy conservation wisdom that's extremely necessary in how we artfully do this together.
This is about a new ecology. I get it, Layman. I find it exhausting talking to women who are so circuitous. They can't make a point. That's their circle energy. And a masculine value is efficiency. Like, let's get to the point. We got to do this thing. Like, just hurry up because I don't have the time. That's valid. I feel that as a woman. So that's why women need to develop their orange, their objectivity. Please get some linearity. Otherwise, you will never be heard. And that's not on men. That's on you. Come out, emerge from the merged. How do you, as a woman, this is why men and women have different developmental trajectories that people aren't talking about. For women, they need to come out of being merged and emerge. Find your masculine, find your voice, find your left brain, start articulating the thing, because we need to have a common language. I've had to, as a very yin essence, learn how to do that, to reach men. And I want to reach men. I want to have this conversation and co-create. It's on me to emerge and individuate and get agency and find my power and show up. The thing that Ken always spoke about and we're not doing as women. Show up so that we can have this adult, mature conversation. And men need to merge a little bit, give some space, share the territory. Don't always do the land claim of the platform or the space. So this is a lower right issue of having this built into structures of community, 50-50. 50-50, men learn some patience while women find their linearity. Women show up, don't be so afraid of finding a voice, and then we can dialogue. And I can't wait. I can't wait. And we do have women beginning to show up, often in their left brain, in their masculine essence, because it's the only way we can be heard. But that will shift. The line and circle is in the future.
I made a kind of a joke in my introduction about officializing this, which I connect with what you just said about the land claim. All right, there's something about efficient symbolic claim and enactment that goes with the masculine. And I think one of the possibilities for making the conversation richer is for that move to be more complex, right? So let's say you're having a discussion and what you're hearing is fluidity or circularity or something like that. When you go, circularity, right? Now I've officialized. Now it's not outside of my frame. Now it's the thing I've identified and I'm going to interact with it that way. So I think if that officializing aspect of the masculine approach can be more aware that there's all these different things that it can categorize, make a land claim on, then it enters into a much richer territory and opens up a lot more space for these other elements to be in that discussion.
Yeah, you're so wise, Layman. You've understood the masculine so well. He's at his best when he can see a pattern. It's beautiful. When you get that about men, it's so beautiful because actually I can see that in myself too. So that's my yang. So if a man can see the structure, it's really stabilizing. So this is architectural. We need to build it into our spaces. So if you even just look at the physical format of power of the dais and the stage and the audience, the men up in a row and the passive audience. Can we mix that up a bit? Representation matters. Can we look at the linear way the seats are arranged, or can we put it in a circle? Can we do both, please? Can we have higher, this is holarchic architecture for the future. It's hierarchy and it's community. So being aware of this as an architectural and engineering element might really help men build this into the structure. Yeah, so that's why I made that post recently with the architectural forms. If we can hold that as a metaphor, that's our future. And it's at every level of existence, particularly epistemologically and ontologically. We can't do that though until the women show up. So
it's going to go to a really, in terms of Cosmocentric, there are these huge themes that are kind of the themes of physics and cosmology. And I'm curious how you see the masculine and feminine when it comes to space and time.
Beautiful. I actually go backwards and forwards on this. And because I'm in multiple Chinese, Indian, Western thinking, they view it differently. So some cultures will see manifestation as Shakti, the feminine, and emptiness and consciousness is the masculine. So the void is masculine, whereas emergence and manifestation is feminine. Other cultures see it the other way around, that the void is feminine, it's infinite potential from which emerges the masculine that is going to individuate. Eros is directional, it's complexifying, it's emergence, that's the masculine from the merged. So I haven't solved this within myself, and I can go backwards and forwards, I can flip. It's like a Rorschach test. 1 minute I see it as emptiness and fullness is masculine and feminine, and then I see it the other way around. And actually I like that to me, that is the interplay at the Eros. It's both at the same time. Existence is fullness and emptiness, and it's up to you which way you see that. You can flip that. And cultural wisdom shows up that it could be either. They've mythologized archetypes in their gods and goddesses, or their, so quantum physics is the particle feminine and the wave masculine, or the other way around. The actual yin-yang structure from nothing to something really leads you to the same place. And sometimes it is so synthesized you can't tell the difference. There's this movement of understanding too in our heads about this nothing and something that is dancing. I love the metaphor of Shiva, who is the god of transformation, and he can show up and personify manifestation. And there's a form of him, Nataraja. He's dancing in a circle. He's holding up the world and he's dancing. And it's when the dancer becomes the dance, that's the non-dual. He shows up as form, but he's experiencing the formless at the same time. I don't know where you begin to separate when they're that beautifully merged, formless and form, yin and yang. All we know is that we're living in that, we're swimming in that binary, and what we do with it is up to us, and it's developmental. And how we create the future means we're aware of that.
There's for me something really important here, which is this delicate edge between the life-giving and the deficient form of that, right? Because we can see these things and we can switch them. We go, oh, okay, well, maybe that one's the yin and that one's the yang. And also we can see them merged, and we can see prior to or simultaneous with them. And there's a kind of, let's say, a postmodern nihilistic seduction, which is to see that and go, well, then that's useless. Well, it doesn't mean anything, right? The fact that you can flip it or they can merge means I don't have to think in those terms at all. And that gives me permission to just enter a kind of meaningless homogeneity. But that's so close to being correct in terms of, yeah, you can switch them and you can be at the point of their merger. So being able to tease those apart seems really essential in order to grow beyond pluralism into some kind of real transpluralism, rather than being stuck with the pluralistic sense of exhaustion or the indifference of all the relativity. That yin and yang open up all these relative dimensions, and they are relative, but you have to explore them all and treat them all as valid and find the places between them to move beyond. If you stop there and sort of shrug it off or throw your arms up, then you end up with this really dead-end version of spiritless culture.
Yeah, so this is where I don't want to complexify too much and lose people, but what is the meaning of the word transformation? It's we're moving beyond even formation. So it's not information or reformation, it's transformation. That puts the onus on us to realize that we're constructing our reality. And as we construct, in the end, that doesn't matter if that's masculine or feminine. All we know is there's a couple of axes going on here. We construct and we deconstruct. And there's entropy and there's negentropy. And that pair makes Eros. If you want to call it masculine and feminine, or this is just a level of trying to understand it. We can move beyond that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's masculine or feminine. All we know is that two things come together and there's a spark. Whether we allocate gender or metaphor to that, it's just a handy way of trying to understand duality. But when you enter the non-dual and it's really available to you, names are irrelevant. It's any language is reductive. Any gender is reductive. So I don't want to complicate things. I'm talking about how do we describe duality and navigate that. We use language, which in itself is reductive and binary. So when we're talking about that other space where there's no differentiation, there's no analysis, there's no distinction. Yeah, form and formless dance, and there's no name. Yeah, so we've got to navigate both, and the best we can do is try to use language. But there's also this place where language doesn't even begin to cut it. The mystery is nameless. That's why I call it the Tao, because that's a teaching that's been around for 3,000 years. That which you try to name is not the Tao. And yet here I am trying to name the Tao.
Well, the container of this interview has only a few minutes left. Is there anything else we want to add here? How do you feel? Do you feel like we've gotten to a place that we should have gotten to?
I do, Layman. I've suddenly entered a place of speechlessness. I just felt that right now, that there's no more to say. Of course, I'm available if anyone wants to talk more about this and use language. I'm trying to become multilingual. That's a second tier job, is to meet everybody where they're at and speak their language. I'm happy to speak. Would also love it if people moved beyond speech and found the state, because that's where it's really at. But we keep trying. This is the beautiful thing about humanity, is we keep throwing ourselves against reality and the mystery to try to understand it. And we use all our languages. the visual, the written, the gestural, the rhythmic. And yet it's always just beyond us. That keeps us moving into the future. It's wonderful.